And on we go to Chapter 9. Hispanic people form a large part of our country's population. They came by various paths and represent a variety of cultures and levels of assimilation. Most U.S.-born Mexican Americans are children of more recent arrivals. They are present in large numbers and continue to arrive. Mexicans comprise the largest group among Hispanics. The second largest group among Hispanics are Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans are another group that don't fit the typical immigrant mold. Technically, they are U.S. citizens and are able to travel to their homeland without restriction. The proximity of the United States to both Mexico and Puerto Rico hampers the assimilation process for both of these groups. Identification has become somewhat of an issue. A recent census showed that Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans prefer to be referred to as Hispanics. Mexican Americans continue to grow as a group with a major concentration in the Southwest, while the Puerto Ricans remain in the Northeast in large urban areas like New York City. In our last chapter, we looked at how Mexican Americans came to be integrated into the U.S. This chapter gives us some background on the Puerto Rican experience. Puerto Rico began as a military outpost of Spain in 1493 and eventually declared itself a republic with representation in the Spanish Parliament. Eventually, they came under U.S. sovereignty. Efforts to Americanize the people were made and citizenship was granted to them in 1917 under the Jones Act. In 1950, Puerto Rico became a commonwealth, giving them autonomy in their internal affairs and protection under U.S. laws. Many Puerto Ricans came to the U.S. after World War II. They are divided over the issue of remaining a commonwealth or becoming a state. As a rule, ancestral languages tend to disappear as a group becomes assimilated. The steady influx of new arrivals from Puerto Rico and Mexico have kept the Spanish language strong and viable. Our public schools take increasing numbers of limited English students yearly. The likelihood of Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans abandoning Spanish hinges on age, length of time in the U.S., population density, and other factors. Bilingual education has become an issue as numbers of English learners increase. Bilingual education reached only a small percentage of students that needed it. Controversy has arisen over whether the school system should maintain the home language or focus on the teaching of English. The Anglo-conformist view is that English should replace Spanish. Pluralists argue that students learn best in their own language and that a variety of language makes us stronger. Most bilingual programs are transitional in nature, moving students from their home language to English. Many Americans see the maintenance programs as anti-assimilationist and promoting separatism. Pluralists see bilingual programs as a means of maintaining diversity and even encouraging Anglo-American children to be bilingual. The issue of language has been present in our country since colonial times. A common language was seen as a means of defining the country and its citizens. Laws have been passed declaring English as the language of our schools despite the needs of the students. Political activist groups such as LULAC and ASPIRA mobilized to protect the rights of students in the Southwest. Segregation of Spanish-speaking students was justified because of their language deficiency. English learners did poorly in school as the issues of language and segregation were debated. LULAC took on the school district in Lemon Grove in 1930, where Mexican students were placed in a separate school. The San Diego Superior Court ruled that depriving the Mexican students of their Anglo-American peers hampered their ability to learn English. Several major court cases brought to light the neglect of the school system toward Spanish-speaking students, culminating with the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision that ended separate but equal policies of the time. These victories, however, didn't completely end segregation. Students continue to be segregated into separate classes due to their inability to speak or understand English. Dade County in Florida showed that students, both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking, learned better in both languages. The Bilingual Education Act was passed in 1968, funding programs and research for bilingual education. Bilingual education gained momentum with the Lau versus Nichols decision in 1974, which opened many doors for bilingual programs in many school districts. Despite the fact that bilingualism promotes high academic achievement, there was strong resistance to it. English-only groups have long opposed bilingual programs, favoring those that focused on teaching English, concerned over the perceived negative effects of other languages in our country. The fact remains that most Spanish speakers want to learn English since they see it as a necessary step to upward mobility. Supporters of bilingual education cite the primacy of Spanish and Native American languages over English and should be exempted from any English-only agendas. Some Anglo-conformists were willing to support transitional-type programs to assist students in moving from their home language to English. Proposition 227 was passed by voters, mandating instruction in English for all students. The idea that there remains a strong push for bilingual education and that English learners continue to lag behind academically indicate that assimilation is not occurring as it has for other immigrant groups. Loyalty to the language is strong, and research shows that while it may be declining slowly, loyalty to other elements of the culture remains strong. Our authors now examine cultural patterns of assimilation. The family unit continues strong even after the fourth generation. Machismo seems to hold sway, with the older men dominating the family unit, while women take on a more subservient role. Williams claims that Mexican-American families are becoming more like Anglo-American families, in that both groups are responding to the social and global changes that press upon them, not because Mexican-Americans are trying to be more Anglo-American. Mexican-Americans and Anglo-Americans both value family ties, yet Mexican-Americans are more likely to maintain ties with a large extended family and relatives. Cultural assimilation seems to be strengthening these ties. Hondagno Sotelo noted that assimilation patterns differed depending on whether an individual migrated alone or with spouse or family. Puerto Ricans are much like Mexican Americans in how they value their families. Child rearing practices and care of their elderly are similar. Both assimilationist and colonialist theories are out the window where Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans are concerned. Mexican Americans are making progress in achieving higher levels of education, although research shows that second generation actually achieve more than the third. Dropout rates among Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans continues to be a serious issue. Although more Hispanics are going to colleges and universities, the rate of completion is still lower than that of the general population. As far as housing goes, racial discrimination seems to persist. Mexican Americans tend to remain segregated from both Anglos and blacks, but less segregated from Anglos than blacks. Factors that reduce the level of segregation are socioeconomic status, suburbanization, and the number of generations spent in the U.S. Segregation remains high for Puerto Ricans whose poverty levels are high, especially in the larger cities of the Northeast. As these other indicators increase, the chances of cross-group friendships increase also. Relationships outside the groups have increased for both Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans across the generations. Marriage outside the groups varies according to geographic area. The increase in the rate of outmarriages has increased gradually and is moving toward marital assimilation. In other areas, Hispanics are joining Anglo social organizations, Protestant churches, and banding together politically. The growing diversity among Latinos has given rise to the idea of an emerging pan-ethnic identity. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans have held fast to their cultural identity and are lagging in the areas of occupation, education, and income. They continue to be segregated in their friendships and marital patterns. Cultural pluralism is still a ways off given the lack of secondary assimilation. The language barrier continues to be a hurdle that impedes Anglo-conformity. Assimilation is slowed by teaching in Spanish, while most curricular programs are designed to phase out Spanish as early as possible. Many Hispanics tend to see the Anglo agenda of replacing the Spanish language and culture as a form of cultural imperialism. Mexican Americans have been misrepresented in many ways. It is essential to refrain from faulting the Mexican American and Puerto Rican cultures for the issues they are experiencing and more closely examine the impact of structural factors and the surrounding society.